All right, welcome. Today we are tackling a huge question, one that sits right at the very foundation of our society. It's all about our relationship with the law, its authority over us, and what, if any, obligations we really have to it.
So let's just put the central puzzle right out there on the table. Do you personally have a moral duty to obey the law? And I'm not talking about just, trying to avoid a fine or getting in trouble. I mean, a genuine, deep down, moral reason to follow the rules. In philosophy, this question actually has a name. It's called political obligation. And notice how specific the wording is here. We're not asking if you should obey a good law, like, say, a law against murder. Of course you should. The real head-scratcher is whether you have a moral duty to obey laws simply because they are the laws.
Okay, so let's start our search for an answer. This whole first section is about that fundamental question. The law, must we obey? We're going to go on a hunt for a solid philosophical reason that actually grounds our duty to the state. First things first, we need to make a really crucial distinction. On one hand, you've got obligations in the law, the specific rules, like don't steal, pretty straightforward. But on the other side, you've got this much trickier idea, an obligation to the law itself, a moral duty to follow a rule just because it's part of the legal system. That's what we're focused on.
So, where do we start looking for this obligation? Well, some of the most popular answers suggest that we've all entered into some kind of deal or a social contract with the state. These are the social contract theories.
The first big idea is consent. And it sounds great, right? Super powerful notion. Governments get their power from the consent of the governed. We agree to be ruled. But here's the problem, and it's a big one. When did you actually sign this contract? Most of us haven't. Philosophers will argue that our consent is tacit or implied, just by living somewhere. But can you really call it consent if you don't have a real choice to just leave?
Okay, so if consent is a little shaky, what about fairness? The argument here is really intuitive. We all get benefits, security, roads, from this big system of cooperation, so it's just not fair to be a free rider. But the counterpoint is that the state's biggest benefits are open benefits. You can't really refuse them. So if you never ask for them and you can't say no, have you truly accepted them in a way that actually creates an obligation?
Let's try one more of these deal ideas. Gratitude. The state gives us so much, right? So maybe we just owe it a debt of gratitude, and the way we show that gratitude is by obeying its laws. It's a nice thought, but philosophy pushes back on this pretty hard. Gratitude seems to require that the person giving the benefits, the benefactor, has good intentions. But can an abstract thing like a state even have intentions? That's a really tough philosophical knot to untie.
So, since all those deal or transaction theories have some pretty serious holes, let's try a completely different angle. What if our obligation isn't some kind of transaction at all, but something more like a fundamental duty?
What if we've been thinking about this whole thing backwards? What if the law isn't some big commander demanding our obedience, but something else entirely? I mean, what if it's more like an expert, a service, that just guides us to make the right choices we already have a reason to make anyway?
This is the core idea from the philosopher Joseph Raz, and it's called the normal justification thesis. Let's break it down real quick. Step 1, you already have a moral reason to do something. Let's say, drive safely. Step 2, the law acts like an expert. It sets speed limits and traffic rules, and it helps you act correctly on that reason much, much better than you could on your own. So that leads to step 3. You are simply better off just following what the law says to do. In this view, the law serves you.
Now that is a powerful idea. Law as a service. But it's got a pretty big limitation. Think about it. An expert like your financial advisor can give you amazing advice. But can they demand you take it? Can they punish you if you say, no thanks? This is where the whole idea kind of blurs the line between helpful advice and binding authority, which of course is what law claims to have.
So if the law isn't a contract and it isn't just an expert advisor, what else is there? Well, the philosopher Ronald Dworkin offered a really fresh perspective with this quote: "Political association, like family or friendships, is itself pregnant of obligation." This idea just shifts the entire frame of reference.
Just think about it for a second. Most of us feel these special duties to our family, to our friends, duties that we didn't really choose or consent to in some formal contract. They just arise from being part of that relationship. So the question this theory asks is a big one. Do we have similar associative duties to our fellow citizens and our political community, just because we're members?
So after exploring contracts and fairness and duty, our search for one single reason to obey the law has led us to a really startling and pretty challenging place: the skeptical conclusion. This leads us to a pretty radical question. After literally centuries of work by some of the most brilliant minds in history, what if the simple truth is that a single, universal reason to obey all laws just doesn't exist?
Now, when philosophers talk about this kind of skepticism, they call it philosophical anarchism, and it's so important to understand what that means. It is not the same as ordinary anarchism. It's not about advocating for abolishing government or chaos in the streets. It's a very precise philosophical position. It's simply doubting that we have a moral duty to obey a law just because it's the law.
But here's the thing. This skeptical conclusion doesn't just leave us in a void. It doesn't mean we have no reasons to obey the law. Actually, it might mean the opposite. It suggests that our real-world reasons for obeying aren't based on one single grand principle, but on a messy, complicated mix of a whole bunch of different factors.
And that brings us to a final, really powerful idea: pluralism. Maybe there isn't one single answer, but many. Maybe our real-world reasons to obey the law are actually this complex blend of everything we've just talked about. You know, we follow a law partly because it seems fair, partly because it offers some expert guidance, partly out of a sense of duty to our community. Our obligation isn't a single thing, it's a mix.
And that leaves us with our final and, I think, pretty provocative thought. If there isn't one single overarching moral duty to obey the law, if our reasons are this complex mixture that we have to weigh in every situation, then how do you, as an individual, decide when to follow, and maybe even more importantly, when to dissent? That's something to chew on. Thanks for joining me.